The biting wind howled through the desolate landscape as ice and snow lashed against the dead trees. Louis sat inside a rickety carriage, listening to the dull creak of wheels rolling over frozen ground. He looked down at the Northern Territory Lord's Expedition Certificate, bearing the royal seal clutched in his hand. 3 months ago, a dump truck hit him and dragged his soul into the body of Duke Calvin's son. Instead of a life of luxury as a noble, he received an immediate appointment as a pioneering baron in the north. This frozen wasteland is permanently barren, desolate, and heavily threatened by ferocious glacial orcs. The Empire nominally controlled the region, but snow country remnants still ruled large areas after a brutal suppression. To weaken noble power and stabilize the frontier, the Emperor ordered noble sons to serve as pioneer lords. As the least successful of 12 sons, Louis was the obvious first choice for this suicidal exile. The family handed him 800 gold coins, several carts of grain, and 44 knights before urging him away. Duke Calvin clearly intended for his useless son to perish quietly in the frozen wilderness, without a fuss. Louis tugged desperately at his heavy cloak, but the bone-chilling cold pierced right through the fabric. Reader, he did not think this through before yelling out curses about missing out on a standard transmigrator cheat. He demanded to know where his system was, and the universe actually decided to answer him. Daily intelligence system loading complete. The system promised several daily intelligence updates covering resource locations, personal secrets, and future events. This cheat code was the ultimate tool for a pioneering lord trying to survive in a hostile world. Having understood how the system worked, Louis could no longer suppress his elation and chuckled softly. His dark, hopeless journey into the northern border finally had a sudden glimmer of hope. At noon today, the third prince of the iron-blooded empire was inspecting stables when he fell into a manure pit and drowned. Duke Calvin's 10th daughter was born, possessing the burst talent in her bloodline. 3 kilometers to the west, glacial fissures will reveal schools of Arctic cod at dawn. Knight Roy has mixed frost scorpion venom into your dinner broth. The first 2 items offered palace gossip and proof of his father's astonishing fertility, but item 3 caught his eye. Arctic cod was a rare delicacy whose bones could purify impurities in a knight's bloodline and raise strength. Then his smile froze completely as he read the warning about the frost scorpion venom in his soup. A knight appointed by his own family was actively plotting to murder him before they even reached their destination. He glanced past the carriage curtains to watch the knights setting up camp around a blazing fire in the snow. A kind-looking knight squatted half-crooked beside a large iron pot, stirring the bubbling broth. That kind-looking man was Roy, and he had just spiked the evening meal with a lethal dose of venom. A chill ran down Lewis's spine as he realized how easily he could have died without his daily intelligence alerts. A knight's voice cut through the howling cold from outside the carriage, announcing that dinner was finally ready. Louis took a deep breath, straightened his clothes, and prepared to step out into the camp. He lifted the curtain and stepped down into the snow as the firelight illuminated the bubbling iron pot. The rich aroma of meat soup mixed with wild vegetables filled the freezing air, waking a sudden appetite. The knights sat around the flames, waiting for their lord to eat first according to proper aristocratic custom. Louis swept his gaze across the gathering before settling his eyes directly on the pot, a dangerous smile playing on his lips. A simple wooden bowl of steaming broth sits on the table, giving off an enticing aroma that hides a deadly secret. Louis lifts the vessel toward his lips before abruptly pausing his movement. Louis spins around on his heel and shoves the bowl directly toward Roy, telling him he has no appetite. Roy breaks out in a cold sweat, desperately trying to refuse the deadly assignment. Refusing to accept any excuses, Louis commands the trembling knight to drink the soup himself. Captain Lambert signals the surrounding guards, who immediately close in to seal off all escape. Realizing his execution is imminent, Roy panics and tries to scramble away from the table, but heavy hands pin him down. The brutal reality sinks in for the guards as they realize the broth was laced with poison. Louis towers over the thrashing traitor, demanding to know who ordered him to commit regicide against his own lord. Roy breaks under the pressure, stammering that Lord Benjamin commanded him to administer the poison. A chilling wave of realization sweeps through the guard captain and his men as they process the internal betrayal. They know Benjamin is the second son of the Duke of Calvin, ruthlessly clearing the board. Roy babbles that Benjamin promised him a southern captaincy and a safe return if the murder succeeded. Louis just lets out a soft chuckle, knowing his brother wants to eliminate every last rival to the title. Desperate to save his skin, Roy blubbers that he was forced into treason and begs for a second chance to serve faithfully. Louis simply utters a quiet command to Lambert, who steps forward and draws his sharp longsword. Roy lets out one final desperate shriek before a flash of silver steel ends his life instantly. A clean swipe sends his head rolling onto the frost, leaving his wide eyes frozen in absolute terror. Lambert calmly slides his bloodied blade back into its scabbard, declaring the traitor has faced justice. A heavy, suffocating silence settles over the camp as the guards stare at the gruesome sight. Every single man in the camp realizes that Roy wanted to escape this freezing exile just as much as they do. Stepping forward, Louis breaks the tense air by announcing that anyone who wants to leave can walk away right now. The guards stare in stunned disbelief, wondering if their lord has suddenly lost his remaining sanity. Louis adds that he will personally clear their names with their families, but warns that deserters will meet Roy's fate. Nobody dares to make a move because they know their aristocratic families will never forgive desertion anyway. Reader, it turns out jumping from the frying pan into the fire is a terrible career strategy. Louis drops his icy glare and tells the men they are not mere trash discarded by pampered castle parasites. He reminds them of the brutal training and real battles that forged them into genuine fighting knights. He asks them to imagine surviving this brutal frozen wasteland and carving out an actual domain of their own. Even the longest winter night eventually gives way to a dawn where the sun will always rise. He swears by the dragon ancestor to share the ultimate glory with every man who stays the course. The Calvin family might view them as disposable pawns, but this untamed wilderness offers infinite room to climb. Louis dangles a massive prize before their eyes, telling them ordinary soldiers can become barons, viscounts, or earls. They can either wallow in self-pity or grab their futures with both hands on this abandoned frontier. A heavy, pin-drop silence hangs over the clearing until Captain Lambert breaks the tension with a sudden thud. Dropping to one knee, he slams his fist into his chest and roars his absolute loyalty to his lord. The rest of the knights immediately follow suit, dropping to their knees in a synchronized wave of fierce devotion. One by one, they shout out their vows to follow Louis to the death, completely turning the tide of the expedition. The motivational speech from the previous evening completely transformed the mood across the entire camp. Instead of shuffling around like dead men, these hardened fighters checked gear with actual purpose. Louis knew fiery words alone would never keep morale high without actual proof of survival. He led his freezing soldiers straight to a solid river of ice to pull off a seemingly impossible trick. Lambert stepped forward first, swinging his heavy iron hammer down hard against the frozen crust. The surrounding soldiers exchanged doubtful glances, silently mocking their lord's sheer naivety. A sharp strike shattered the thick barrier, and deep frigid water immediately bubbled up through the fresh gap. The men dropped heavy fishing nets into the depths, holding their breath in tense silence. Without warning, the thick rope jerked violently in their hands as something huge fought back beneath the surface. Shouting in surprise, the knights hauled upward with every ounce of strength they possessed. A massive northern crystal cod broke the surface in a flash of silver light and flopped hard onto the ice. Reader, they actually caught fish in a frozen wasteland where nothing should live. Net after net hauled up 12 gleaming fish total from the freezing depths of the river. One knowledgeable veteran immediately recognized the catch and started shouting in sheer disbelief. This was the legendary northern crystal cod, a rare, frigid delicacy whose bones could purify blood and enhance strength. Even southern nobility rarely tasted such a priceless treasure in their lifetime. Before the men could even finish dreaming about taking a single sip of the broth, Louis casually announced that half would go into a communal soup pot for everyone. The declaration hit the exhausted soldiers like a thunderbolt of pure ecstasy. Shouts of praise echoed across the frozen plains as ragged men wept openly at such unprecedented generosity. Soon enough, a massive cauldron bubbled over an open fire, turning into a pale, silvery soup that shimmered with ethereal specks of light. The rich aroma instantly made every starving stomach roar. Wooden bowls were handed out to the trembling men who still could not quite believe their luck. Louis downed his portion in a single unbroken gulp without a trace of hesitation. The moment the hot broth hit their stomachs, a fierce wave of internal energy washed away every impurity clogging their veins. The entire camp went dead silent as every soldier started chugging. Dropping into meditative postures, the fighters frantically circulated their breathing techniques to absorb every drop of the potent energy before it faded away. A sharp cry shattered the quiet stillness as a young apprentice soldier began glowing with intense silver radiance. The brilliant aura signaled an instantaneous breakthrough to a higher realm. Before anyone could process the first miracle, a second apprentice violently convulsed and broke through his bottleneck too. Two formal knights forged from a single bowl of soup. The entire camp fell into a stunned silence before erupting into a deafening roar of pure disbelief. Achieving such a rank in the South took years of grueling cultivation and massive resources. All lingering doubts regarding their exiled commander vanished instantly, replaced by fierce, unshakable loyalty. They realized this wasn't mere luck. Their lord held divine favor. Unified under a single, brilliant banner, the roaring soldiers pledged their absolute lives to the man who gave them a future. The kindness shown to them had only just begun. Lewis sits cross-legged on the cold ground, closing his eyes to operate the tidal breathing technique passed down in his family. Deep breaths echo in his chest like the ebb and flow of the ocean, absorbing the rich energy of the northern crystal cod. This gentle yet violent energy reshapes his bloodline from the inside out, making his meridians clearer and warming his bones. He feels his blood rush faster through his limbs as the transformation takes hold of his entire physical frame. He finally exhales slowly as the intense heat inside him settles into a calm, steady baseline, and his breakthrough finishes. He has advanced to an intermediate rank official knight, a level of strength that makes him a true rarity among common folk. Reader, he is still considered the absolute worst among the Duke of Calvin's sons because his older brother is already a decorated top-tier knight. A knight's power comes entirely from awakened bloodlines, divided into 6 massive stages with brutal gaps between them. He is no longer in a hurry to lament his status since the daily intelligence system gives him access to future opportunities. After absorbing every drop of the fish soup's essence, he stops his breathing technique and opens his eyes. He immediately notices the knights around him staring with total adoration before deafening cheers suddenly tear through the entire camp. They roar out, "Long live the Lord," in unison, shaking the frost from the nearby pines with their thunderous noise. Hearing those loud cheers lets Louis finally breathe a sigh of relief because his prestige has been initially established. At least for the moment, he will not have to waste any energy worrying about whether these rough knights will stay loyal. Once the roaring cheers finally die down, Louis looks over at Lambert and asks how much further they have to go to reach Frostspear City. Lambert steps forward to reply respectfully that they are still about 200 kilometers away from the northern capital. Lewis calculates that the trip normally takes 5 or 6 days, but he immediately orders his men to speed up and arrive in 3 days. Lambert acknowledges the command without hesitation, knowing the morale of the knights is high enough to push through the snow. Frostspear City serves as the primary military and political center of the northern province and the ultimate destination for their march. Louis wants to claim his own territory as early as possible to secure the best land before everyone else arrives. What truly drives his eagerness to reach the city are the 3 pieces of fresh intelligence the system provided him this morning. The first tells him that Well, a future pinnacle knight, is about to be dragged into the local black market by slave traders. A peak knight represents top-tier combat power in this world, making young Well an invaluable investment for Lewis's future ambitions. The second piece of information concerns an alchemy apprentice named Hilco, who stole a secret formula and is fleeing in disguise. Hunted by the Gold Marrow Guild, Hilco has also been captured by slave traders and is heading straight to the Frostspear City black market. Since official alchemists are exceedingly rare and valuable assets, snatching up an apprentice for a low slave price is a steal. The third piece of intelligence concerns Duke Edmund losing his mind because all the major noble families are dumping their spoiled brats up north. Even without the system, Louis could have guessed that sending useless heirs to the frontier would infuriate the governor. If handled correctly, this influx of useless nobility might actually fit nicely into his broader plans for expansion across the frozen wastes. With so many massive opportunities waiting behind the gates of Frostspear City, they need to close the distance immediately. Thick stacks of paperwork slam heavily onto the heavy wooden desk inside the governor's office as Duke Edmund erupts in pure fury. Papers scatter wildly across the stone floor, reflecting the sheer anger twisting the duke's face into a terrifying scowl. He curses the Empire for sending him a pack of blood-sucking parasites to drag down his defenses instead of real soldiers to hold the line. 2 years ago, a bloody rebellion nearly ripped the entire north away from imperial control and breached the outer walls. He led elite troops through 3 brutal months of slaughter to crush the rebels, losing half his army and his only son in the process. Now the Emperor expects spoiled noble brats to stabilize the frontier, but the families just sent their absolute worst trash. He flips through the reports in disgust, reading out loud about compulsive gamblers, 15-year-old brothel regulars, and good-for-nothing sons. Duke Calvin's eighth son is even listed as a low-ranking official knight who idles away his days on family handouts. These pampered fools grew fat on the blood and iron conquered by their ancestors, caring only for petty power struggles in the capital. They do not give a single damn about the safety of the empire or the survival of the northern borderlands. The heavy wooden desk groans under the weight of his rage, while the palace staff keep their heads down in terrified silence. Edmund finally forces his anger down into a chilling calm, deciding that these useless arrivals will simply have to fend for themselves. Since the Empire's aristocratic gifts are nothing more than a joke, the North will simply have to rely on its own strength to survive. Reader, he did not expect any of those useless parasites to actually amount to anything. A heavily armored column of more than 40 knights trudges across the freezing snow toward Frostspear City. At the center of the procession rolls a sleek, black carriage bearing a striking crimson crescent moon banner. A tall and slender young man steps out from the carriage, lowering his hood to reveal a striking face. He announces himself as Louis Calvin, an imperial baron of the frontier arriving to pay his respects to Duke Edmund. The guards exchange stunned glances upon hearing his surname, well aware the Calvin family is one of the 8 great families of the Iron Blood Empire. Knowing they cannot afford to neglect him, a soldier hurries inside to report his arrival. A middle-aged official soon rushes out to greet them, escorting Louis and his heavily armed retinue through the imposing stone gateway. They pass into the settlement, stepping past heavy fortifications into the heart of the provincial capital. Inside the walls, wide streets are choked with deep potholes where melting snow and mud mix into a wretched sludge. Most buildings are crude structures of rough stone and wood, punctuated by ruined shells collapsed under the wind. Sparsely populated pedestrians fall into 2 distinct groups: weary northern soldiers in fur coats carrying cold battlefield stares, and blank-faced commoners in coarse cloth. Louis observes the desolate scene with total calm, knowing northern scarcity makes maintaining any order a feat. The official guides Louis and his men straight into the governor's office for their scheduled audience with the ruler. The interior is stark and utilitarian, featuring only a heavy wooden table, old bookshelves, and a dark blue military flag. Seated behind the desk is Duke Edmund, the brutal de facto controller of the northern province, with a hideous scar across his face. His imposing presence radiates a suffocating oppression, and he scrutinizes Louis with immediate, open disdain. Dismissing Louis as a mid-level formal knight, Edmund openly mocks the young man's looks compared to his illustrious older brother. Louis stays entirely expressionless, knowing full well that in this dog-eat-dog world, weak strength naturally invites contempt. Refusing to waste time on pleasantries, Louis pulls out the official pioneering certificate stamped with the royal seal and drops it down. He declares his true purpose, demanding to register and claim his rightful pioneering territory right here and now. Edmund glances at the paper just long enough to confirm his status before pulling a detailed northern map from a stack of documents. He spreads it across the table, telling Louis he can pick any area not currently blocked off in red. The vast northern provinces span an immense territory, roughly half the size of Russia, yet only a dozen red circles mark unselectable zones. Under the Northern Frontier Reclamation Orders, early arrivals get absolute priority in picking their initial sites. Reader, he did not just stumble in blind. He had been filtering system intelligence data for days to find the absolute best plot. While other noble scions stall in the south to avoid the frozen wasteland, Louis prepares to reap the rewards of showing up first. Louis stretches out his finger and firmly taps a specific location on the map, surprising the battle-hardened Duke. Located in the southeastern region at the junction of the Blue Rock Rift and Grey Moss Tundra, it sits 75 kilometers from Frosthowl Fjord. This exceptional zone enjoys relatively warm temperatures allowing cold-resistant crops, a nearby stream for fresh water and fishing, and valuable cold iron veins. In a perpetually frozen and resource-starved wasteland, it is practically a hidden gem of a territory. Duke Edmund raises his head to look at the young lord with entirely new eyes, realizing Louis is far sharper than a typical playboy. Breaking his usual cold demeanor, the Duke praises the selection, admitting it takes genuine vision to spot such a prize. Louis betrays no arrogance at the compliment, responding with cool humility that he merely tried to make the most sound judgment. His composed demeanor wins even more respect from Edmund, who gives him an approving pat on the shoulder. Edmund casually grabs a heavy steel stamp bearing the Frost Halberd emblem and brings it down hard on the registration document. With a heavy thud, the paperwork is officially validated, locking in Baron Louis's absolute sovereignty over the land. Louis accepts the stamped document, his fingertips brushing the steel emblem as he works hard to keep his outward expression calm. Inside, however, he is celebrating wildly at securing such a devastatingly valuable tract of land right under the governor's nose. If Edmund had any inkling of the territory's true hidden value, he would have locked it down himself instead of letting it slip away. Armed with his system intelligence and his new title, Louis turns away from the desk, ready to build his northern empire. I claimed 300 square kilometers of frozen northern land for my initial expansion territory. I chose to name this harsh domain Red Tide Territory to honor my lost homeland. Duke Edmund only saw it as barely habitable, but I knew the truth about this place. First, the rivers here swell with schools of migrating fish every spring and autumn. That reliable source of high-calorie protein will easily feed both my people and my hungry soldiers. We might even reel in legendary catches like the northern cod. Second, geothermal eruptions create a miraculous pocket of warmth in the frozen north. This natural heat raises the surrounding soil temperature to grow cold-resistant crops. It will keep everyone alive through the biting winter without freezing to death. Reader, the best part is that the geothermal heat feeds a natural hot spring. When the northern gales howl and everyone else shivers, I will soak right here with a cup of hot soup. Honestly, just thinking about that luxury puts me in a fantastic mood. Beyond warmth and food, this territory holds massive mineral wealth beneath its surface. While ordinary cold iron ore is common up here, a hidden magic marrow vein runs along the border. That volatile substance is the exact key to crafting powerful explosives. Seeing me stand there frozen with the Pioneer certificate still in hand, Duke Edmund broke the silence with a teasing grin. He offered to invite me to stay for a meal before I left his presence. I snapped out of my daydream and coughed lightly to compose myself. Before leaving, I had my knights haul 2 heavy wooden crates right into the center of the hall. When the lid of the first box flew open, 3 live northern cod flopped out into the air. Their silvery white scales gleamed brilliantly in the flickering firelight. Duke Edmund's eyes suddenly went wide at the sight of those legendary fish. Even as the governor of the north, he barely managed to acquire such rare treasures. Yet here I was, casually dumping 3 live ones right onto his stone floor. The flesh of a northern cod is delicious, but its bone essence supercharges a knight's physique and vitality. It is the ultimate shortcut for warriors stuck in a stubborn cultivation bottleneck. His own daughter happens to be stuck right at that exact beginner elite level. Before the old fox could even speak, I smiled and declared those 3 fish were a gift to the Duke. Edmund paused and stared at me like I had lost my entire mind. Giving away such a priceless resource without asking for payment was unheard of. Before he could process my generosity, I popped open the second wooden box to reveal 3 more identical fish. I flashed a wide grin and told him those ones were strictly for making a business deal. That finally broke his composure and earned a loud laugh. Duke Edmund finally burst out laughing with a clear glint of admiration in his eyes. He asked me straight out what I wanted in exchange for such an insane offering. I answered without a single second of hesitation that I needed people to build my army. I told him I needed slaves, soldiers, craftsmen, and trained knights to fill my empty domain. Hearing that convinced Edmund I had zero intention of drifting through the northern wasteland to die quietly. I was here to carve out a real empire from scratch. Edmund offered 50 green recruits, but I instantly countered by demanding 150 men. He scoffed at my greed and shook his head at the audacity. We finally hammered out a compromise for 120 untrained new recruits. Along with the soldiers, he threw in 30 craftsmen to lay down the foundations of my new territory. They might not swing swords, but those carpenters and masons are entirely irreplaceable for building roads and houses. Without them, my territory remains a wasteland. When I pushed for full-fledged knights, Edmund scoffed that I was dreaming. After some hard bargaining, he conceded 10 apprentice knights and 3 formal knights to my command. They would obey my orders while maintaining formal loyalty to the north. I extended my hand across the table and locked in the deal with a firm grip. Edmund shook my hand and muttered a dry warning not to die too quickly in the frozen wastes. 6 fish had just bought me the core talent I desperately needed to survive. With the employment contracts signed and tucked safely away, I turned to make my exit. but Edmund called out with a knowing smirk and asked if I was waiting around for a farewell banquet. He told me I had better hit the slave market before heading north. The Duke warned me that relying solely on a handful of refugees would never be enough to populate my barren lands. He immediately ordered a royal official to escort me down to the slave market. He wanted to make sure local merchants wouldn't fleece me blind. The official bowed deeply to his master and gestured for me to follow him out of the chamber. I offered a sincere word of gratitude to the Duke for his unexpected kindness. Edmund just waved a hand lazily, signaling us to clear out. Reader, I didn't need the reminder because I already had my eyes on a couple of specific talents waiting at the market. With my new garrison and craftsmen marching behind me, we headed straight out into the cold streets. The foundation of the Red Tide territory was finally moving. Every single piece was falling right into place, just as my intelligence system promised. The harsh northern winds whipped against my cloak as we approached the wooden gates of the pen. It was time to pick up the final pieces of my starting roster. We step into the freezing eastern market of Frostspear City, where a biting wind howls past rough wooden sheds and simple stalls filled with animal hides and roasted meat. Once a quiet trading post for locals, this market transformed into a chaotic hub after the Northern Frontier Expansion Order brought greedy merchant guilds rushing in like wolves. Over at the eastern edge, a crude wooden fence pens in ragged slaves with bowed heads and bruised bodies who have learned to fear the sharp crack of the trader's whip. Traders loudly hawk their human merchandise, boasting that these captive laborers can mine, log, and work harder than oxen without ever complaining to their masters. Spotted by a sharp-eyed trader, Louis and his official companion draw an immediate, oily grin as the merchant rushes forward to hawk his finest northern stock. My official escort frowns at the man's oily tone, quickly reminding the trader that he is speaking directly to Baron Calvin and should watch his greedy tongue. The trader waves his hands in frantic denial, insisting he is an honest businessman, offering fair prices to young and old alike across his entire inventory. He paces down the line of captives, patting their bony shoulders and swearing they eat next to nothing while outworking beasts of burden from dawn until dusk. Lowering his voice with a sleazy smirk, the merchant hints at higher-end southern goods, carefully trained to satisfy a master's every private desire. Louis frowns almost imperceptibly at the gross suggestion, dismissing the extra merchandise with a curt shake of his head. The merchant pivots back to a polished sales pitch without missing a beat, nodding furiously and praising Louis for having the foresight to buy practical serfs. Louis surveys the pale, malnourished crowd standing before him, noting how many can barely keep their legs steady beneath the bitter northern chill. His gaze cuts through the crowd and locks onto a frail boy trembling like a frightened animal in a woman's arms, looking entirely unremarkable to anyone else. Thanks to my system's hit and prompt, I know this terrified kid named Will carries the untapped potential to grow into a legendary knight who can shift wars. Over in a dark corner, an even thinner man keeps his head bowed low and his messy gray hair draped across his face to vanish completely into the miserable crowd. Louis spots the unassuming fugitive instantly, recognizing Hilco, the hunted alchemy apprentice who fled north after stealing secrets from the south. Sensing a big sale, the trader slaps his own chest and swears up and down that buyers will never regret investing in these sturdy workers. Louis cuts through the rambling sales pitch and asks the crucial question, wanting to know the exact price tag for these human commodities. The merchant cheerfully quotes 8 silver coins for adult men and 4 silver coins for women and children, keeping prices reasonable under the official's watchful eye. Nodding decisively at the fair terms, Louis orders all 380 slaves right on the spot and sweeps through other pens for another 120 souls. That massive haul of 500 slaves costs a staggering 380 gold coins, draining my treasury until only 68 gold coins remain. While gathering supplies over 2 days, I watch fellow summoned nobles drown their despair in cheap ale or curse the emperor for sending them to this wasteland. 2 days later, a massive caravan of nearly 1,000 people gathers outside the city gates, loaded down with food, seeds, farm tools, and weapons. Louis mounts his steed, gazes out toward the untamed wilderness of our new home, and gives the command for the Red Tide Territory convoy to finally move out. Rows of simple iron pots bubble over open fires, filling the camp with the hearty aroma of wheat porridge. Starving slaves stand in long queues, clutching rough wooden bowls with tearful, grateful eyes. George stands behind the stove, ladling out generous helpings, muttering under his breath in sheer panic. He is convinced that this reckless generosity will bankrupt their supplies in no more than half a year. Louis casually waves away all concerns, snapping that hungry people simply need to eat without any needless fuss. Reader, he did not think this through, leaving poor George to quietly plan his own rescue stash. A daily intelligence update materializes before his eyes, listing 3 completely separate events across the northern region. The first 2 details regarding Baron Hayes and Emily Edmund pass by as mere trivia. The third piece of information instantly changes his mood, warning of a hungry pack of dire wolves lying in ambush. 70 starved beasts are waiting in the canyon ahead, planning to ambush the supply convoy. Louis immediately summons the Knight Captain Lambert and orders him to scout the surrounding canyon thoroughly. Lambert nods without hesitation, dispatching his mounted men in small groups to scour the snowy terrain. The night squad moves slowly through the snowdrifts, assaulted by a thick, fishy stench of rotting beast flesh. Lambert dismounts to inspect the ground, brushing away the surface snow to reveal deep claw marks. Lambert kneels in the snow to examine the deep, messy claw gouges left by desperate predators who gave up hiding. He immediately recognizes the severe danger and hurries back to deliver a full report to Louis. Louis shows zero sign of panic upon hearing the scout report, calmly declaring that they will see who the prey is. He orders makeshift traps set up right inside the canyon to lure the ravenous pack into a corner. A starved dire wolf lies flat in the snow, its thick, grayish-white and dark blue fur providing perfect camouflage. Its eerie green eyes lock onto the distant convoy, trembling with the explosive power of raw hunger. The massive Wolf King lets out a chilling howl, signaling dozens of dark figures to rise silently from the snowdrifts. They creep forward like ghosts, closing in on the convoy until a heavy wooden stake snaps. A hidden wooden stake mechanism springs upward with a deafening crack, instantly impaling the leading attackers. Blood stains the white snow crimson as the startled pack scatters in every direction. Ambushed soldiers on the flanks unleash a storm of arrows that tear through the freezing air with deadly precision. Several wolves take hits straight to the throat, rolling helplessly into the snow as they choke. Lambert leads the counterattack with a sweeping slash of his longsword that leaves a brilliant silver arc behind. The knights charge forward with ignited fighting spirit, turning the snowy wasteland into a slaughterhouse. A knight leaps into the air with a glowing red spear, impaling a charging ice wolf with explosive physical force. The brutal strike blasts a massive crater into the frozen ground, pinning the carcass securely. Another knight swings a great sword wreathed in crimson battle aura flames, cleaving a sneaking giant wolf in half. Warm blood blooms into bright crimson flowers across the snow as the surviving beasts lose their nerve. The knights tighten their formation and slaughter the fleeing beasts amidst a chorus of desperate, dying screams. Every single sword strike takes a life, leaving the blood-soaked snowfield littered with heavy carcasses. Only the blood-soaked Wolf King remains standing alone on the ruined snowfield, glaring at Lambert with raw fury. It lets out a final, ferocious roar and lunges forward with claw swipes capable of tearing steel. Lambert effortlessly sidesteps the heavy blow as a brilliant red light surges over his longsword blade. With a sharp shout, he brings his weapon down like a thunderbolt to end the standoff instantly. The Wolf King's massive head is cleanly severed from its body, sending hot blood splattering across the snow. The carcass crashes heavily to the ground, bringing the surprisingly swift battle to a total close. Lambert turns without breaking a sweat to report the total eradication of the 70-strong dire wolf pack. They tally up an immense haul of thick pelts, sharp teeth, and a literal mountain of fresh meat. Louis inspects the bountiful spoils with a satisfied nod, ordering the meat shared among the men for a feast. The soldiers cheer with heartfelt devotion, their gazes shifting from mere obedience to deep recognition. After a grueling trek lasting several dozen days, Louis finally brought his convoy to the desolate expanse of Red Tide territory. Lifeless and frozen, the barren land stretched out before them without even a single patch of green to break the monotony. A knight from the south muttered in dismay at the poverty of the region, questioning why they had been sent to such a lifeless dump. Louis ignored the complaint, choosing instead to dismount and carefully study his new domain. While others saw only death, Louis knew from his intel that this neglected dirt was actually a goldmine of untouched resources. Geothermal energy, mineral deposits, rich fisheries, and vast arable tracts were all waiting to be exploited. Determined to turn this frozen hell into the richest territory in the north, Louis immediately barked out orders to start the construction. Temporary tents went up first, followed by logging operations to timber houses and clearing training grounds for the soldiers. The sounds of logging and shouted commands finally shattered the long silence of the valley, injecting a raw pulse of life into the wilderness. Louis knew he had to personally inspect every corner of the territory before locking down his master development plan. Wandering through the southern sector, Louis noticed steam curling off patches of melted snow and reached down to touch the ground. To his absolute astonishment, his palm was met with a surge of genuine warmth from a hidden geothermal vent. He soon stumbled upon several natural hot springs nearby, a luxury practically unheard of in the freezing north. The thought of kicking back in steaming mineral water while rival lords froze their tails off brought a deeply satisfying smirk to his face. Moving to the riverbank, Louis watched as thin ice cracked and slow water revealed a handful of sluggish fish darting near the edge. His intel promised this would explode into a massive breeding ground come spring, securing a reliable food supply for his people. Just as he weighed his options, a scout team of knights came galloping back with breathless reports of a major discovery. They had scoured the deep northwest mountains and struck literal gold in terms of northern resources. The scouts breathlessly reported a massive vein of cold iron ore hidden deep within the northwest mountain range. Lambert practically choked on his own spit when they added that deeper tunnels held a strange ore glowing with a dark red light. Lambert gasped at the mere mention of a magic marrow mine, knowing it represented a fortune that could bankroll an empire. Louis just nodded coolly, already well aware of its existence through his system intelligence. Leaving the natural wonders behind, Louis stepped into the local indigenous settlement and hit a wall of grim reality. Stagnant, putrid mud choked the pathways, while crooked mud brick shacks loomed dangerously under the biting northern wind. The local residents were a pitiful sight, consisting mostly of elderly women and skeletal children wrapped in ragged strips of cloth. Shivering from the cold, the kids peered out from shadowy doorways with deep wariness etched across their gaunt faces. Frowning at the systemic neglect, Louis asked how a place could fall into such absolute ruin under past administrators. An embittered local replied that the original lord had abandoned them and fled south long before the winter frost set in. Unable to stomach the suffering of children after a lifetime of modern sensibilities, Louis dismounted and offered some dry rations. The kids stared at the food like it might bite them, too terrified of tricks to make a grab for it. The overpowering aroma of food finally broke their resolve, and the starving children snatched the rations and wolfed them down raw. They swallowed in frantic terror, terrified that someone might snatch the meager meal right back out of their hands. Louise noticed one little boy standing apart, carefully concealing his share of the dry ration inside his threadless tunic. Stepping closer, Louise gently asked the dirty-faced child why he wasn't eating his share of the food. The little boy looked up with big, fearful eyes and whispered that he wanted to save it so his mother could eat too. Louis stood frozen as the brutal contrast hit him like a physical blow. While southern nobles fed prime cuts of meat to pampered hounds, these children hoarded dry breadcrumbs like treasure. Boiling with sudden purpose, Louis roared out a promise to feed and house anyone willing to work his land, finally piercing their numb despair. Louis stands on a freezing hillside, staring down at the desolate wasteland that will eventually become the heart of the Red Tide territory. The barren ground offers little comfort, but its proximity to a geothermal vent keeps the deadly northern cold just barely at bay. Mick, the most seasoned craftsman acquired from the Duke of Edmund and now appointed as the construction officer, asks if they should finally begin erecting the castle. Louis immediately shoots down the idea, opting to prioritize the living quarters for their people instead. The old craftsman is utterly taken aback when Louis declares he will share a communal dwelling with the common folk instead of claiming private luxury. Seeing his young lord show such disregard for northern hardships makes Mick look at him with newfound respect. They settle on building semi-subterranean collective dwellings, marrying northern survival architecture with Viking longhouse designs. Sinking the structures one-third into the earth and reinforcing the willow branch walls with mud creates an easily insulated home. Reader, he actually designed a practical housing crisis solution in a weekend. Construction breaks into hyper-efficient groups of 20, pairing soldiers with slaves and refugees to tear into the permafrost with a relentless, clockwork division of labor. The frozen ground fights back with every strike, numbing wrists and forcing thick sweat from exhausted slaves who swing crude shovels into the dirt. Armed soldiers patrol the pits, shouting harsh urgings to keep the work moving without pause. Louis steps right down into the muddy trench, rolling up his sleeves to test the brutal labor himself as the workers stop to stare in disbelief. After 10 minutes of heavy digging, He acknowledges how exhausting the work is and grants everyone an early break. He makes a point of rotating through every active site, breaking a sweat alongside the laborers before calling out that dinner is almost ready. Even the soldiers who initially hated doing manual labor swallow their complaints since their lord is bleeding right beside them. Lewis drifts from site to site like a royal morale bomb, dropping quick praises, checking timber frames, and promising hot soup when the batch is finished. With full bellies and a working lord, the slaves work like absolute maniacs to beat the freezing night. In just a few days, a cluster of mound-like, semi-subterranean dwellings erupts from the frozen earth around the geothermal vent. Thick turf roofs and mud-plastered willow walls lock in the heat, giving the territory the best housing the North has ever seen. With the settlement secured, Louis decides that concrete survival needs a healthy dose of morale, sparking a massive bonfire to host the territory's very first celebration. Nearly 1,000 refugees, slaves, and soldiers crowd around the flames to push back the dark. Louis stands tall upon a raised rock formation, draped in his dark cloak, his features cutting sharply against the blazing bonfire light. He surveys the massive crowd of broken people who have finally found a roof over their heads. Louis declares that with these houses built, the land is now theirs, and they are the true masters of the Red Tide territory. But the crowd just stares back in utter silence, completely paralyzed by a lifetime of servitude and unable to process the concept. Realizing that freedom is a foreign language to these broken souls, Louis decides to teach them through hard, tangible proof instead of empty speeches. He raises his hand, and his steward steps forward with a long roll of parchment. Hilco unrolls the parchment scroll and begins reading off the names of the most diligent and loyal workers from the construction sites. Every name called out hangs heavily in the frosty air over the quiet assembly. The moment their names echo across the clearing, the targeted slaves shrink back in sheer, unadulterated terror. In their brutal past, being singled out by a lord's voice always meant cruel punishment, torture, or a swift death. Some of the men start trembling uncontrollably, staring at the frozen ground and wanting nothing more than to beg for mercy. They have no idea that their entire existence is about to be flipped upside down by a lord who actually keeps his word. As the trembling names hang in the cold night air, the entire gathering holds its breath to see what kind of cruel fate awaits their peers. Louis watches them calmly, fully prepared to rewrite what it means to survive in the merciless North. Reader, he is about to hand out life rafts to people who forgot how to swim, and the shock is going to break them. Louis waits for the fear to settle before he delivers the rewards that will cement his legend as a truly benevolent lord. With homes built, bellies full, and loyalty forged in the fires of shared labor, the Red Tide territory plants its flag deep into the northern permafrost. The game has officially begun, and Louis is just getting warmed up. A cluster of shivering slaves stepped forward into the biting cold, their chests pounding with deep dread as they awaited their fate. They stood shoulder to shoulder around a towering bonfire, casting terrified glances at the looming figure of Louis waiting before them. Louis addressed the tense gathering with an even voice, acknowledging their relentless toil toward building the Red Tide territory from scratch. He promised them a compensation far greater than mere scraps, holding up the physical proof of their lifetime bondage. Without an ounce of hesitation, he tossed their binding slave contracts straight into the crackling flames of the fire. The hungry orange tongues devoured the ink and parchment, burning away every last legal trace of their lifelong subjugation in seconds. Stunned silence gave way to explosive weeping as a weathered, middle-aged man collapsed flat against the frozen earth. He hammered his forehead repeatedly into the hard ground, weeping openly and bleeding from the impact as overwhelming joy broke him. A young female slave buried her face in her trembling hands, her shoulders convulsing as hot tears thawed her frozen cheeks. She sobbed out loud, utterly overwhelmed by the sudden mercy of a man she had expected to treat them like disposable tools. All around the plaza, the remaining slaves stared with wide, bloodshot eyes at the newly liberated souls kneeling in the dirt. A sharp pang of bitter remorse gnawed at their guts, cursing themselves for not working harder to earn this exact miracle. Just as the crying settled into a breathless hush, Louis dropped an even bigger bombshell on the desperate crowd. He declared that every single month, more than 10 hard-working slaves who contributed to the territory would earn their freedom. The prospect of climbing out of hereditary hell broke their emotional dam completely, offering a genuine future where their children wouldn't be born in chains. Clever men hit the dirt first, crying out praises that quickly rippled across the square. Hundreds of hoarse, cracking voices merged into a deafening tidal wave of absolute devotion that rattled the freezing night air. They chanted the title of their savior over and over, transforming from numb, beaten laborers into fanatical believers. Nearby knights watched the spectacle unfold with sheer bewilderment, struggling to comprehend how mere words could turn broken people into zealots. Even the younger fighters looked deeply unsettled, wondering how a lord commanded such absolute worship. Standing high above the surging crowd, Louis understood the raw psychological power behind a simple verbal promise and a clear ladder of upward mobility. He knew complete, instant emancipation would breed instant chaos, so he built a structured reward system instead. His gaze shifted past the civilians directly to the patrolling soldiers and elite knights standing watch at the perimeter. Servants cracked open heavy wooden chests, revealing stacks of thick leather armor and sturdy winter boots freshly hauled in. The moment Louis offered the gear to his men, the soldiers surged forward like starving wolves toward the open boxes. In the brutal, freezing north, proper footwear and armor were mythical luxuries that kept men from losing their toes to frostbite. Men inspected the genuine leather armor and wolf pelt padding with trembling fingers, marveling at the quality of gear they had only ever dreamed of owning. Reader, if you have never patrolled an ice wall in paper-thin shoes, you cannot fathom the sheer poetry of a dry boot. Lewis watched them lose their minds over basic supplies, knowing exactly how precious every scrap of metal and hide was in this barren wasteland. Securing absolute loyalty in Frostspear City didn't require magic. It just required hitting the exact pain point of a freezing army. The equipment distribution seamlessly melted into a roaring feast as servants hauled massive, golden-brown roasted beasts straight to the fire. Rich, sizzling meat fat dripped directly onto the burning logs, sending up clouds of mouth-watering smoke. Every single person in the territory, down to the lowest slave, received a fair, steaming cut of the roasted game. When the first bite of hot meat hit their empty stomachs, long-forgotten warmth brought open tears to many hardened faces. Laughter and wild cheering finally pierced the eternal gloom of the northern night as refugees danced around the leaping flames. Indigenous women twirled hand in hand to the shrill tune of a bone flute, while children chased each other through the snow. Even the stoic soldiers let their guard completely down, joining the dance circles and competing with clumsy, roaring laughter around the heat. The entire clearing pulsed with a vibrant, desperate joy that pushed back the crushing weight of the northern winter. From his high perch above the roaring celebration, Louis surveyed the chaotic, beautiful scene of survival and newfound hope. These desperate people had pinned their entire existence on him, and he swore to lead them through the coming frost to prosperity. Hilco has been driven completely insane by a crushing avalanche of paperwork. Just because Louis casually told him to register the basic information of the Red Tide Territory residents, he is now trapped. He stares blankly at a group of clueless farmers and blacksmiths who barely know their own names. When asked what they can do, one man shrugs and mutters, he is simply good at surviving. Hilco curses his past impulsiveness while copying name after name into the ledger. He bitterly regrets stealing an alchemy recipe from his mentor in the Emerald Federation. He was once a regular alchemy apprentice who took a dangerous gamble for a massive payout. A mysterious black market buyer offered him a fortune to steal his mentor's prized secrets. His master discovered the missing recipe almost immediately, triggering a massive manhunt. The Golden Marrow Guild issued a high-priority warrant to bring the thief to swift justice. The black market buyer was quickly apprehended and confessed under interrogation. Realizing he was next, Hilco knew capture meant becoming a guinea pig for twisted alchemical experiments. To escape his fate, he disguised himself as a slave and mingled with a transport convoy heading out. But the slave traders proved far more ruthless and shrewd than he ever anticipated. Whenever he tried to make a break for it, a merciless whip reminded him of his place. After a few brutal reality checks, he quietly gave up trying to resist. He officially became an ordinary slave, terrified that revealing his alchemy background would get him sold straight back to the guild. Eventually, his path led right to the Frostspear City Market. He expected to spend his life mining in a dismal pit until a young pioneer lord named Lewis bought him. Instead of being treated like livestock, his literacy and accounting skills saved him. Louis shocked him by revoking his slave status, sharing food with the starving, and tearing up contracts to grant freedom. To Hilco, treating slaves as human beings felt less like a lord and more like a cult. Reader, he did not plan to stay a humble servant forever. While he admitted he caught a lucky break, he secretly plotted his escape from this godforsaken territory. Bringing his misery to a temporary close, Hilco drops the heavy survey book onto Louis's desk. His face shows deep weariness, and his steps are completely unsteady. Louis flips through the pages casually, noting the surprisingly thorough categorization. From elderly farmers to weaving women and young hunters, every detail shows massive effort. Louis looks up at the tired young man, fully aware of his secret identity as a fugitive guild apprentice. His intelligence network flagged Hilco long before the purchase. He keeps the secret to himself because a literate administrator is far more valuable right now than an alchemist. Basic infrastructure is still missing, and the land needs a functioning bureaucracy. Opening the book again, a satisfied smile creeps across his face as he reviews the human resources. The desolate Red Tide territory holds far more potential than he initially expected. The population exceeds 1,000, packed with a solid foundation of farmers, herders, and experienced fishermen. It is more than enough raw manpower to build a self-sufficient domain. Dozens of hunters, blacksmiths, and carpenters provide the exact gears needed for a functioning society. He sent Hilco out not just for records, but to understand the territory's inner cogs. A lord who fails to understand his people can never control their future. With the data sorted, the next step is assigning every gear to its proper place to get the land running. Louis massaged his aching temples as the massive influx of regional data swirled through his head. Surviving on windfalls and intelligence networks alone could never feed nearly 1,000 mouths. He needed a permanent economic foundation right now. He looked up at the bone-tired Hilco and told him to grab a quill and write down every single order. 100 fishermen were to be dispatched immediately to the riverbank to build a temporary dock. They needed to prep their boats before the spring thaw brought massive spawning runs. Hilco scribbled down the Lord's instructions word for word, forcing his heavy eyelids to stay open. Louis explained that establishing cold water aquaculture along the river would eventually free them from relying entirely on wild catches. Agriculture and animal husbandry came next, on the chopping block for this freezing domain. Over 400 farmers were currently focused on land reclamation in a harsh northern zone. Louis planned to tap into natural hot spring water to thaw the frost. The soil might be poor, but geothermal heat combined with cold-resistant rye and potatoes would change everything. Meanwhile, 50 seasoned hunters would scout the forest edge to keep ravenous monsters and hostile outsiders away from the perimeter. Craftsmen would finally be pulled together into a unified workshop to forge farm tools, stitch winter clothes, and build houses. Reader, the man actually had a coherent industrial policy instead of just screaming at people to work harder. Hilco's cynicism toward nobility completely melted away as he watched his lord in action. Instead of a hypocritical aristocrat treating peasants like livestock, he found a competent leader who actually knew how to deploy his resources. The entire settlement roared to life under a flurry of organized commands and relentless effort. Hunters checked their gear, fishermen mended nets, and the rhythmic clang of smiths' hammers rang through the freezing night air. Spring finally arrived in the north, though most surrounding lands remained locked under unbreakable ice. But the earth right beneath Louis's feet was entirely different, soft and moist with hidden life. That miracle was entirely thanks to Louis ordering hot spring water channeled into the fields a week prior. The farmer scooped up a handful of warm soil, utterly baffled that he could feel actual heat in the northern wasteland. Standing right beside Louis was Mick, the newly appointed agricultural officer of the Red Tide territory. Mick used to be a nameless slave until Louis's daily intelligence system flagged his freakish, instinctive talent for soil and crops. When Louis stripped away his slave status and handed him real authority, Mick repaid the kindness with absolute, back-breaking loyalty. Holding a handful of rich dirt, the agricultural officer declared that everything was finally ready. At Mick's roaring command, hundreds of farmers drove their iron plows deep into the fluffy soil. Cheers erupted as the heavy blades sliced through the thawed ground without hitting frozen resistance. Next came the base fertilizer operation to supercharge the newly thawed dirt for maximum crop yield. A dozen wooden carts rolled into the fields loaded with a pungent mixture of organic waste and alchemy products. The concoction combined human and animal excrement, straw, fish entrails, and powdered clods straight from the alchemists. It smelled like absolute garbage, stinging every nose within a mile, but nobody dared complain. Even Louis stood right beside the reeking piles without showing a single trace of disgust. Everyone knew that this foul-smelling sludge was the only ticket to surviving the brutal winter ahead with a full harvest. Mick firmly stomped his boot onto the derek earth, confirming that seed planting could begin in just 4 days. Louis gave a crisp nod of approval before turning away to handle other pressing matters. He wasn't fleeing the brutal fertilizer stench, but rather responding to a fresh update from his daily intelligence system. 3 brand new intelligence drops had just materialized in his mind, demanding immediate tactical processing. System Intelligence Update. A starving pack of frost wolves has been spotted moving toward the western timberline. System Intelligence Update. A merchant caravan from the south is carrying illegal contraband hidden inside grain shipments. System Intelligence Update. An abandoned iron ore vein lies buried beneath the northern hills just 2 leagues away. Lewis stared at the glowing notifications with a calculating smirk spread across his face. Wolves, smugglers, and a brand new iron vein all dropping on the same day meant his expansion plans were about to hit overdrive. With the land thawed, the crops prepped, and fresh secrets landing in his lap, the Red Tide territory was locked onto a terrifying trajectory of growth. Lewis turned back toward his headquarters, ready to conquer the next crisis. 3 mysterious updates suddenly pop up on my daily intelligence system, each one packed with wild potential. The first drop reveals that the Cold Moon Tribe chieftain just got poisoned to death. The second note points straight to a pack of ice wolf cubs hiding out in the Green Rock Rift Valley. Reader, my ears perked up instantly at that one. The final update claims a merchant named Jack will sell cranberry seeds containing over a dozen Frostblood Redberry seeds in Frostspear City 4 days from now. I raise an eyebrow because normally this system feeds me total garbage, but today all 3 pieces are absolute gold mines. That Northern Barbarian Cold Moon Tribe is a massive power player. Their bloodlust berserkers and archers have given Duke Edmund endless headaches, and now a dead chief means total civil war. The whole North is about to tear itself apart at the seams. Of course, I am just a tiny fry starting out with 0 power to sway barbarian politics right now. My only job is building up my own strength before the coming storm hits us. That brings us to the second intelligence, pointing me right to those Icefield wolf cubs in the Azure Rock Rift Valley. Adult dire wolves are terrifying apex predators that nobody can tame. Their razor-sharp sense of smell makes them unmatched scouts, but grown ones refuse human masters. Grab the cubs young, however, and I can build an elite Wolf Riders unit for Red Tide territory. What a stroke of absolute luck, since their parents were probably that exact wolf pack we wiped out on our march here. I decide right then and there to set off with my men the very next morning. Then my eyes drop to the third piece of news and I actually burst out laughing. Frostblood Redberry seeds are an insanely rare mutation packed with thick magic juice. They supercharge a Bloodline Knight's battle aura and skyrocket their cultivation growth, making them the ultimate territory specialty. But even if I sprint flat out, I will never make it to Frostspear City in 4 days. I cannot afford to gamble on someone else snagging those berries first, so I immediately summon Lambert and 2 elite knights. Lambert is my rock-solid guardian knight, and I trust him completely with this mission. I tell Lambert to ride hard and reach Frostspear City within 3 days flat. He needs to stake out Merchant Jack on the east side of the market 2 days early and buy every single seed. Lambert has no clue why a few berry seeds matter so much, but he swallows his questions and salutes. He knows from experience that my crazy calls always turn out right in the end. Since they are heading to the city anyway, I decide to send a quick letter back to my cold-blooded father's merchant guild to report we survived and ask for gold. I seal the parchment with my personal crest and hand it directly to Lambert with strict orders to deliver it to our family's guild without any screw-ups. Lambert and his 2 companions swing up onto their saddles and thunder across the frozen wasteland toward Frostspear City. Reader, they rode like the hounds of hell were snapping at their heels. The very next morning, I lead 5 elite hunters and 8 regular knights straight across the frozen ground toward the Azure Rock Rift. Hunter Iger marches at the front, confirming the wolf pack lost its alpha. We slip cautiously into the ravine and spot fresh bloodstains from the brutal infighting that tore the wolf pack apart last night. Only a few elderly she-wolves and helpless cubs remain huddled deep inside the cave. I split our crew into 2 squads, ordering the hunters to scatter bloody venison and animal bones soaked in fresh gore right outside the cave entrance. The reeking blood lure works instantly as 5 giant adult direwolves burst from the shadows, charging straight after our horse-dragged bait. Our knights wheel their mounts around and butcher the entire pack in a lightning-fast ambush. While our knights handled the adult beasts outside, My hunters and I slipped quietly into the heart of the wolf pack's den. We needed to secure what was waiting inside before the adults finished dying. Huddled in the deep chill of the cavern were over 20 snow-white dire wolf cubs, shivering in pure terror. Their thick coats made them look like fluffy little pillows, but they were already trying to growl. Ager licked his lips at the sight, but our hunters moved in with pieces of meat laced with a powerful herbal sedative. We tossed the drugged meals close to the edges of the rock crevices. Hunger quickly won out over caution as a few bold pups crept forward to nibble the bait. Soon the rest swarmed the meat, shoving each other aside in a desperate race for every last bite. It took less than 2 minutes for the sedative to hit their small systems like a freight train. The wary little fighters suddenly became completely dazed, swaying unsteadily on their paws. Reader, they went down like toddlers after a sugar crash. Our men swiftly bundled the sleepy pups into thick animal hides to keep them from bruising during the rough trek back. A few stubborn ones tried to twist away and fight back to the very end, but they were far too weak to matter. We packed all 20-odd captives safely into specially made leather bags. With our pockets full of future apex predators, I gave the order to pull out. The hunters shouldered their wriggling bags, and we rejoined our knights to march back to Red Tide territory. Back in Red Tide territory, we settled our new prizes into a sprawling wooden enclosure lined with dry grass and soft hide dens. We tried to make it feel like home, minus the frostbite. Naturally, the little guys were still terrified and hostile after being ripped from their den. They pressed into a tight ball, pricking their furry ears and flashing tiny, razor-sharp teeth. My eyes locked onto one particular outlier standing dead center in the enclosure. He was easily more robust than the rest, with long limbs and a look of pure, unbridled arrogance. While every other pup whimpered in a huddle, this absolute unit stood completely upright, staring back at us with zero panic. You could tell right down to its bones that it was built differently. Iger took one look at the beast and whispered that we were staring at a potential wolf king. I smiled and decided right then and there to name the arrogant little bastard Leng Feng. I turned to Iger and asked him how on earth we were supposed to tame a cage full of future killers. You could practically hear the cold sweat run down the old hunter's back at the sudden test. Iger scrambled to gather his thoughts, explaining that we had to establish dependency through food so they'd see humans as providers. But he knew food alone wouldn't cut it with wolves. He laid down the hard truth. If a wolf guards its food or fights back, you pin it to the ground until it breaks. In the wild world of a pack, raw fists are the only rule that matters. I nodded along as he pointed out that Leng Feng was the undisputed leader of the bunch. If you break the king, the rest of the pack falls in line behind him without a second thought. Iger took a breath and dropped the kicker, telling me I had to step up and tame Leng Feng personally. The surrounding hunters looked at him like he had completely lost his mind. Thanks to my daily intelligence system, I already knew Iger was a low-key Naster beast tamer. I slammed a hand onto his shoulder and put him in charge of all beast taming in Red Tide territory. Iger dropped to one knee, completely overwhelmed after going from a freezing northern outcast to a trusted lord's official handler. The other hunters could only watch and seethe with envy.